I see you got your notice, she said, her voice carrying that particular satisfaction of someone whose plan was working perfectly. Yeah, I got it. I folded the letter and stuck it in my jacket pocket. 30 days seems a little unreasonable for winter work. Oh, I think it's perfectly reasonable, Karen replied. After all, you've had months to address these issues voluntarily. The county is simply providing the motivation you apparently needed. The condescension in her voice made my jaw clench. These aren't issues, Karen. They're buildings doing their job. Buildings that are dragging down property values for the entire neighborhood. Her mask of politeness was slipping, revealing the steel underneath. Did you know that preliminary assessments show Whispering Pines properties could lose up to 8% of their value due to proximity to substandard structures? 8%. She'd put a number on it, made it sound scientific and official. Never mind that the number was probably pulled from thin air by her pet appraiser. Those are functional agricultural buildings, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. They're supposed to look like working structures because that's what they are. Karen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Jake, this isn't the 1950s anymore. Modern agricultural operations can be both functional and attractive. There are beautiful barn designs that would serve your needs while actually enhancing the neighborhood instead of detracting from it. At whose expense? Well, yours, naturally. They're your buildings. The casual assumption that I should spend thousands of dollars to make my property more pleasing to her eyes was breathtaking. She was standing on my land, looking at buildings my family had built and maintained for decades, telling me they weren't good enough for her standards. And if I refuse? Karen's smile turned predatory. The county has several enforcement mechanisms available. Fines that increase daily until compliance is achieved. Liens against the property. In extreme cases, even condemnation proceedings. Condemnation. She was threatening to have my family's land condemned because she didn't like the color of my barn paint. You've really thought this through, haven't you? I am simply looking out for the community's interests, she replied primly. Someone has to maintain standards. That night, I called Bill Crawford again. His response was exactly what I expected and exactly what I didn't want to hear. They've got you in a corner, Jake. The county notice gives them legal authority to enforce whatever standards they choose to apply. Fighting it in court would cost more than just painting the damn buildings. So I give in? Or you get creative? There was something in his voice that made me pay attention. What's your property zoned for? Agricultural with residential. Why? What are the height restrictions for agricultural buildings? I had to think about that. I don't think there are any specific restrictions. Agricultural buildings are generally exempt from residential height limits, as long as they serve a legitimate agricultural purpose. Interesting. And what constitutes a legitimate agricultural purpose? Hay storage, equipment storage, livestock shelter. Pretty much anything related to ranch operations. Very interesting. I could hear the smile in Bill's voice. Jake, what if instead of just painting your old barns, you built a new one? I don't need a new barn. Maybe not, but you might need a very large hay storage facility. Something that could hold a year's worth of hay for your entire operation. Something that would be a clear agricultural necessity. I was beginning to understand where he was going with this. How large are we talking? Well, that would depend on your storage needs, but I'd imagine a serious rancher might need something quite substantial. Perhaps even prominent. Prominent. I started to smile for the first time in weeks. The next morning, I drove into town and paid a visit to the county planning office. The clerk was helpful and friendly, pulling out zoning maps and regulation books as I explained that I was considering expanding my agricultural storage capacity. Height restrictions for agricultural buildings? she repeated, flipping through pages. Let's see. There's no specific height limit for structures serving legitimate agricultural purposes. You'd need building permits, of course, and the structure would have to meet safety codes, but as long as it's functionally necessary for your operation. What about setback requirements? Standard agricultural setbacks apply 50 feet from property lines. But that shouldn't be a problem on 40 acres. I thanked her and drove home, my mind already working through the possibilities. That evening, I called a contractor I'd known for years, a man who specialized in agricultural construction and had never met a building challenge he couldn't solve. Frank, I need a barn. A big barn. How big are we talking? I looked out my kitchen window at Karen's house, clearly visible across the fence line. Her second-story windows looked directly across my property, giving her a perfect view of my eyesore buildings. Big enough to store a year's worth of hay for 100 head of cattle. Frank whistled. That's a lot of hay. You're talking about a 60, maybe 70-foot structure. 70 feet sounds about right. That's going to be tall, Jake. Real tall. Visible from a long way off. I smiled, watching lights come on in Karen's kitchen windows. That's the idea. But what I didn't know was that Karen had already prepared for the possibility that I might try to build something new. She'd researched every possible angle, including agricultural exemptions, and she was confident she could stop any new construction before it started. Her next move would test just how far she was willing to go to win this war. The permit application process should have been straightforward. I was proposing a legitimate agricultural structure on agricultural land for a clear agricultural purpose. Frank had drawn up plans for a 40-foot by 80-foot hay barn with a 70-foot roof peak, massive by residential standards, but perfectly reasonable for storing the amount of hay needed to feed cattle through a Montana winter. I submitted the application on a Wednesday morning. By Friday afternoon, I had a call from the planning office. Mr. Morrison? This is Janet Walsh from County Planning. I'm calling about your barn permit application. Is there a problem? Well, we've received some concerns about the proposed structure. The Community Standards Committee has requested a public hearing before approval. A public hearing for a barn on my own property. What kind of concerns? The scale of the proposed structure, primarily, and its potential visual impact on surrounding properties. I felt the familiar anger building in my chest. It's an agricultural building on agricultural property. What's the visual impact got to do with anything? Well, normally nothing. But given the location adjacent to a residential development, the Planning Commission feels a public review would be appropriate. The public hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday at the county courthouse. I arrived early, expecting maybe a handful of people and a quick rubber stamp approval. Instead, I walked into a packed room with every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Karen sat in the front row, wearing what looked like her most expensive suit and surrounded by a dozen residents from Whispering Pines. Behind her, I recognized several faces from the development, all wearing expressions that ranged from concerned to hostile. She'd mobilized her entire neighborhood against my barn. The hearing started with the planning commissioner reading my application aloud, a straightforward request for a hay storage barn. Then, Karen stood up. Mr. Chairman, I am speaking on behalf of the Whispering Pines Community Standards Committee and 47 concerned residents who will be directly impacted by this proposed structure. 47 residents. She'd done her homework, gathering signatures and statements from people who probably had no idea what they were signing. The proposed barn, Karen continued, consulting notes that looked professionally prepared, would be a 70-foot tall structure located less than 200 feet from residential properties. This massive industrial building would dominate the skyline, block scenic views, and create what amounts to a wall between our community and the natural landscape we moved here to enjoy. Industrial building. She was describing a hay barn like it was a factory. Furthermore, she went on, the applicant has shown a consistent pattern of property maintenance neglect. His existing structures are deteriorated eyesores that have already impacted our property values. Allowing him to build an even larger eyesore would be irresponsible governance. One by one, residents of Whispering Pines stood up to voice their concerns. They talked about blocked views, decreased property values, the industrial character of the proposed structure, and the need to preserve the rural residential character of the area. It was masterfully orchestrated. Karen had turned my hay barn into a threat to their entire way of life. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up facing a room full of hostile faces. This is a hay storage barn on a working ranch. It's designed to store feed for my cattle operation, which has been running on this land for 3 generations. The structure meets all county building codes and agricultural requirements. But why does it need to be so tall? Asked one of the commissioners. Frank, my contractor, had anticipated this question. Hay storage requires vertical space for efficient loading and ventilation. A 70-foot peak height allows for proper air circulation and maximum storage capacity while maintaining structural integrity. Couldn't the same storage be achieved with multiple smaller buildings? Karen interjected. At significantly higher cost and lower efficiency, Frank replied. This is standard agricultural practice. The debate went on for an hour, with Karen's supporters raising every possible objection to my barn. They questioned whether I really needed that much storage, whether the height was truly necessary, whether the location could be moved farther from their property. Finally, the commission chairman called for a decision. While the proposed structure meets county agricultural building requirements, the commission is concerned about its impact on adjacent residential properties. We're going to table this application pending a site impact study. A site impact study. More delays, more bureaucracy, more chances for Karen to find ways to block my barn. As the crowd filed out, Karen approached me with a smile that was pure victory. Jake, I hope you understand this isn't personal. We're simply trying to protect our community's character. By stopping me from building a barn on my own land. By ensuring that new construction is compatible with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. That night, Bill Crawford delivered the bad news. A site impact study can take months and cost thousands of dollars. Even if you pass, they can require modifications that essentially kill the project. So she wins. Not necessarily. But you need to think about this differently. How? What if you didn't need a permit? I stared at the phone. What do you mean? Certain agricultural activities are exempt from permitting requirements if they meet specific criteria. Temporary structures, for instance. Or structures that replace existing buildings. Replace existing buildings? Your old barn is in pretty bad shape, right? Structurally unsound, maybe even dangerous? I looked out at my barn, solid and functional despite its weathered appearance. But in the right light, with the right documentation, it could certainly look like it needed to be replaced for safety reasons. It could be, I said slowly. And if you were replacing a dangerous structure with a new one in the same location, that might qualify for emergency agricultural replacement permits. Much faster process, much less opportunity for interference. How much faster? Days instead of months. And the public hearing requirement doesn't apply to emergency replacements. I was starting to understand, but the new structure would have to be in the same location as the old one. Generally speaking, yes. Though there's some latitude for improved placement for safety or efficiency reasons. The old barn sat on a slight rise in the middle of my property, clearly visible from Karen's house, but not particularly close to the property line. A replacement barn in the same general area would be just as visible, but it would be legal and permitted before anyone could object. What constitutes a dangerous structure? I asked. Structural instability, safety hazards, code violations. Things that could pose a risk to people or livestock. The next morning, I called Frank. How fast can you tear down and replace a barn? If we're talking about an emergency replacement, we could have the old one down and the new one framed inside of a week. And the permit process. Emergency agricultural replacement permit can be approved in 24 hours if you have proper documentation of the safety hazard. I looked at my barn, solid and functional, but undeniably weathered. In the cold morning light, with the right camera angle and professional assessment, it could definitely look dangerous. That afternoon, I hired a structural engineer. But what I didn't know was that Karen had been monitoring all permit applications related to my property. The moment an emergency replacement permit was filed, she'd be ready with an injunction and a team of lawyers who specialized in stopping exactly this kind of project. Karen called my ranch an eyesore. I built a skyscraper barn towering over her house. Hook. The morning I found Karen Henderson standing in my driveway with a clipboard, wearing that familiar smirk that meant trouble. I should have known she was about to declare war on my family's century-old ranch. What I didn't expect was that her petty complaint about my unsightly property would end with me building a 60-foot architectural masterpiece that cast her pristine McMansion into permanent shadow. Sometimes the best revenge comes with planning permits. The setup. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a third-generation rancher living on 40 acres of prime Montana land that my grandfather bought back in 1952. Our property sits on a gentle hill overlooking the Bitterroot Valley, with the main house my great-grandfather built from local timber, weathered red barns that have stood for decades, and rolling pastures where our cattle have grazed for 3 generations. It's not fancy, but it's honest land with honest buildings that serve their purpose. The trouble started when the Whispering Pines development went up on the adjacent property 5 years ago. Suddenly, our rural road was lined with cookie-cutter mansions, each one trying to outdo the next with architectural flourishes that belonged in a suburb, not ranch country. The new residents seemed to think they'd moved to some kind of rustic theme park where actual working ranches should look like something out of a Western movie set. Most of the new neighbors kept to themselves, but Karen Henderson was different. She'd moved into the largest house on the development's edge, a gaudy 8,000-square-foot monument to excess with white columns, fountains, and manicured gardens that required a team of landscapers to maintain. From day one, she made it clear she considered herself the unofficial mayor of our little stretch of rural Montana. I first met Karen at a neighborhood barbecue the Hendersons threw to get acquainted with the locals. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to move in the wind, designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had that particular brand of confidence that comes from never being told no and having enough money to make problems disappear. "So you're the rancher," she said when we were introduced, looking me up and down like she was appraising livestock. How quaint. I just loved the authentic Western lifestyle you people maintain. You people. Right there, I knew we were going to have problems. Been ranching this land for 3 generations, I replied, keeping my voice level. My grandfather would be proud to know it's still working land. I followed her gaze to my barn's solid functional structures that had weathered decades of Montana winters and summers. They weren't pretty by subdivision standards, but they were perfectly suited to their purpose. The red paint had faded to a rustic patina, and the metal roofs showed their age, but every board was sound and every door still hung straight. They work just fine, I said. Function over form. Karen's smile turned a little tighter. Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it. The conversation moved on, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She spent the rest of the evening stealing glances at my property, and I had the uncomfortable feeling I was being evaluated for deficiencies. But what I didn't know was that Karen had already started making phone calls to the county planning office, asking about zoning regulations and property maintenance ordinances. The barbecue was just reconnaissance. I first met Karen at a neighborhood barbecue the Hendersons threw to get acquainted with the locals. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to move in the wind, designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had that particular brand of confidence that comes from never being told no and having enough money to make problems disappear. "So you're the rancher," she said when we were introduced, looking me up and down like she was appraising livestock. How quaint. I just love the authentic Western lifestyle you people maintain. You people. Right there, I knew we were going to have problems. "Been ranching this land for 3 generations," I replied, keeping my voice level. "My grandfather would be proud to know it's still working land." "Oh, how wonderful," Karen cooed, but her eyes were already scanning my property visible through the trees. Though I have to say, some of those buildings look like they've seen better days. "Have you considered updating them? Something more aesthetically pleasing?" I followed her gaze to my barn's solid, functional structures that had weathered decades of Montana winters and summers. They weren't pretty by subdivision standards, but they were perfectly suited to their purpose. The red paint had faded to a rustic patina, and the metal roofs showed their age, but every board was sound, and every door still hung straight. "They work just fine," I said. "Function over form." Karen's smile turned a little tighter. "Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it." The conversation moved on, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She spent the rest of the evening stealing glances at my property, and I had the uncomfortable feeling I was being evaluated for deficiencies. But what I didn't know was that Karen had already started making phone calls to the county planning office, asking about zoning regulations and property maintenance ordinances. The barbecue was just reconnaissance. 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, when the aspen leaves were turning gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter, I was fixing a section of fence when I heard footsteps on gravel. Karen was marching up my driveway like she owned the place, clipboard in hand and wearing what I'd come to recognize as her official business face. "Good morning, Jake," she called out with false cheerfulness. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to discuss something important with you." I set down my hammer and wiped my hands on my jeans. "What can I help you with, Karen?" She positioned herself so she had a clear view of my property, clipboard held like a shield. "Well, as you know, I've been elected as the chairwoman of the Whispering Pines Community Standards Committee." This was news to me. Community standards for what? "For maintaining property values and ensuring our neighborhood presents an attractive appearance," she said, consulting her clipboard like she was reading from a legal document. "We've recently expanded our oversight to include adjacent properties that might impact the aesthetic quality of our community." I felt my jaw tighten. Adjacent properties like mine. Exactly. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Now, I want to be clear that we're not trying to interfere with your livelihood. We simply believe that certain improvements could benefit everyone involved." She flipped to a new page on her clipboard, revealing what looked like a detailed assessment form. "I have conducted a preliminary survey of your property, and I have some concerns about the visual impact on our home values." "Visual impact," I repeated slowly. "Your barns, specifically." Karen gestured toward my buildings with the authority of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "They're quite weathered. The faded paint, the aging metal roofing, the general rustic appearance, it all contributes to an impression of neglect that could be affecting property values in Whispering Pines. I looked at my barns, seeing them through her eyes for the first time. Yes, the red paint had faded to more of a rust color, and yes, the metal roofs showed patches and weathering from decades of use. But they were solid, functional buildings that housed my equipment, stored hay, and provided shelter for my livestock. They were exactly what barns should be. Those buildings are over 30 years old, I said carefully. They're working structures, not decorations. I understand that, Karen replied with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. But surely you can see how they might be perceived as an eyesore by residents who've invested significantly in this area. Eyesore. The word hit like a slap. These weren't just buildings to me. They represented decades of my family's sweat and sacrifice. My grandfather had built the original barn with his own hands, working evenings and weekends after his day job to create something that would serve his family for generations. My father had added the equipment shed and the hay barn, each one built to last and serve a purpose. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. Karen brightened, as if she'd been waiting for this opening. Renovation, primarily. Fresh paint in colors that complement the neighborhood aesthetic. Perhaps some architectural details to make them more visually appealing. Maybe even consider replacing some of the older structures entirely. Replace them with what? Something more in keeping with the upscale rural aesthetic we're trying to maintain. There are some beautiful barn designs that look authentic but have modern styling. Very tasteful. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. She wanted me to tear down my family's barns and replace them with designer versions that looked like barns but were really just expensive decoration. Karen, I said, choosing my words carefully, those buildings are functional parts of a working ranch. They're not there for decoration. Her expression hardened slightly. I'm not asking you to compromise functionality. I'm simply suggesting that functionality and aesthetic appeal aren't mutually exclusive. And if I choose not to make these improvements, the mask slipped a little, revealing something colder underneath. Well, that would be unfortunate. The Community Standards Committee has been working with county officials to explore options for maintaining neighborhood quality standards. There may be regulatory avenues available if property owners aren't willing to voluntarily maintain appropriate standards. There it was, the threat disguised as helpful suggestion. She was telling me to pretty up my ranch to suit her idea of what a neighborhood should look like, or she'd find legal ways to force me to do it. I see, I said. And who gets to decide what constitutes appropriate standards? The committee, of course. We have excellent taste and a strong commitment to preserving property values. The arrogance was breathtaking. A woman who'd lived here for less than 5 years was telling a third-generation rancher that his family's buildings didn't meet her aesthetic standards. I'll consider your suggestions, I said, knowing I was lying but needing time to figure out what my options were. Karen's smile returned, bright and predatory. Wonderful. I knew you'd be reasonable about this. Shall we say 60 days for initial improvements? 60 days? Just to show good faith. Fresh paint, perhaps some basic repairs. Nothing too ambitious initially. She turned to leave, then paused as if struck by a sudden thought. Oh, and Jake? I should mention that the committee will be conducting regular assessments going forward. We want to make sure our community standards are being maintained consistently. As I watched her walk back down my driveway, her heels clicking on the gravel with military precision, I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about control. Karen had decided that my ranch didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should look like, and she was going to use whatever authority she could manufacture to force me to change it. But what I didn't know was that she had already scheduled a meeting with the county zoning officer for the following week, armed with photos of my property and a folder full of regulations she planned to weaponize against me. 2 weeks later, I got my answer about just how far Karen was willing to push. I was in the middle of morning chores, hauling feed to the cattle, when a white county truck pulled into my driveway. The man who climbed out wore a khaki uniform and carried an official-looking folder, never a good combination when you're minding your own business on your own land. "You, Jake Morrison?" he asked, consulting a paper in his folder. "That's right. Tom Bradley, County Zoning Compliance Officer. I'm here about a complaint filed regarding potential code violations on your property." My blood pressure spiked, but I kept my voice level. "What kind of violations?" Bradley seemed uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Well, there's been a complaint about building maintenance standards, potential safety hazards, and aesthetic impact on the surrounding area." Aesthetic impact isn't a zoning violation. No, but building maintenance can be, depending on the condition. He pulled out a camera. "I need to document the current state of your structures for my report." I watched him photograph my barns from multiple angles, taking notes on his clipboard after each shot. The morning sun was hitting the weathered wood just wrong, making every faded board and rust spot look worse than it was. In the harsh light, and from his angle, I had to admit my buildings looked rough. "These structures appear to be in poor repair," he noted, shooting pictures of a section where the red paint had weathered away completely. "When was the last time they were painted?" "About 8 years ago," I admitted. "But they're structurally sound. Want to take a look inside?" "That won't be necessary for this assessment." He was clearly following a checklist, not actually evaluating the buildings. "The concern is about exterior appearance and its impact on neighborhood property values." There it was, again, property values. Karen's fingerprints were all over this visit. "Who filed the complaint?" I asked, though I already knew. "The complaint came through the Whispering Pines Community Standards Committee," Bradley said, reading from his folder. "They've provided documentation of their concerns, along with photographs and property value impact assessments." Property value impact assessments. Karen had done her homework. Bradley spent another 20 minutes documenting what he called maintenance deficiencies, photographing every weathered board, every spot where metal roofing showed rust, every place where time and weather had left their mark on buildings that had been serving their purpose faithfully for decades. "So what happens now?" I asked when he finished. "I file my report with the county planning office. If they determine there are code violations, you'll receive a formal notice with a timeline for corrections. And if I don't agree with their determination, you can appeal through the county commission, but that's a lengthy process." He packed up his camera and clipboard. "Honestly, Mr. Morrison, it might be easier to just address the cosmetic issues. A fresh coat of paint goes a long way toward resolving these kinds of complaints." After he left, I stood in my driveway, looking at my barns through Karen's eyes, trying to see what she saw. Yes, they were weathered. Yes, the paint had faded and the metal showed age spots. But they were solid, functional buildings that housed my livelihood. They weren't hurting anyone, and they certainly weren't a safety hazard. That evening, I called my lawyer, a crusty old rancher's attorney named Bill Crawford, who'd been handling agricultural legal issues for 30 years. "Jake, you've got a problem," he said after I explained the situation. "This Community Standards Committee doesn't have any legal authority over your property, but they're using county zoning enforcement as their weapon. Can they do that?" "Unfortunately, yes. If they can document what the county considers maintenance violations, they can force you to address them. The tricky part is that maintenance can be pretty subjective." "So I have to paint my barns to make Karen happy?" "Not necessarily. But you need to be smart about this. They're counting on you to either comply or fight it the wrong way. What's the right way? Bill chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. That depends on how creative you want to get. The next morning brought another surprise. I found Karen in my driveway again, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit stood beside her, along with another woman I didn't recognize carrying what looked like surveying equipment. "Good morning, Jake," Karen called out brightly. "I hope you don't mind, but we're conducting a more thorough assessment of the situation." "What kind of assessment?" The man in the suit stepped forward. "Robert Chen, professional property appraiser. Mrs. Henderson has commissioned a study on the impact of building maintenance on area property values." They were building a case, documenting everything they could use against me. The surveyor was taking measurements and notes while Chen photographed my buildings with professional equipment. Karen supervised with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan was coming together perfectly. "This is quite comprehensive," Chen noted, taking shots of my barn from the angle that showed the most weather damage. The contrast between the maintained properties in Whispering Pines and the deteriorated structures here is quite dramatic. I felt my temper starting to fray. Those aren't deteriorated structures. They're working buildings on a working ranch. "Of course," Corinne said smoothly. "No one's questioning their functionality. We're simply documenting their visual impact on the surrounding community." They spent 2 hours on my property, measuring, photographing, and taking notes. By the time they left, I felt like I'd been dissected and cataloged. Karen's parting smile was pure triumph. She knew she was winning. But what I didn't realize was that she'd already submitted a formal petition to the County Planning Commission, requesting an expedited hearing on what she called chronic code violations affecting community property values. The hearing was scheduled for the following month, and she'd invited every resident of Whispering Pines to attend and voice their concerns about my Eyesore property. The certified letter arrived on a gray November morning when the first snow was starting to dust the peaks. Official county letterhead, formal language, and the kind of bureaucratic authority that could make anyone's stomach drop. I opened it standing by my mailbox, the cold morning air making my breath visible as I read. "NOTICEOFCODEVIOLATION" was printed in bold letters across the top. The letter detailed what it called multiple violations of county building maintenance standards, including deteriorated exterior surfaces, inadequate structural maintenance, and aesthetic conditions detrimental to neighborhood property values. I was being given 30 days to remedy all cited deficiencies or face potential legal action, including fines and enforcement measures. 30 days. In the middle of Montana winter, with cattle to feed and equipment to maintain, they wanted me to drop everything and repaint buildings that didn't need repainting just to satisfy Karen's aesthetic preferences. I was still standing there reading when I heard a car door slam. Karen was climbing out of her pristine white BMW wearing a heavy coat that probably cost more than my monthly hay bill and boots that had never seen mud.